Oh, hello. It's really nice to be here. Nice to see all your faces. Um, so so my name's Rachel. I live in Walthamstow, which is in East London. And you might think, well, why is somebody from Walthamstow talking about getting outside? Because you think, oh, London doesn't really seem kind of the place to be for green, wild spaces. But I'll talk a little bit about kind of my story and what led me to the place that I am now. So do you want to show me slide, Margaret? I've got a very pretty slide with my lovely little Curious Wild picture on, so you don't have to look at my mug all the time, which would be much nicer, I'm sure. There we are. You can go straight to 3 if you want. That'd be marvellous, if you like. On the click. Yeah, that's it. There we are. So I thought pictures is nicer than looking at me talk, really. So my journey outside. So I always, when I was really little, I enjoyed being outdoors more than indoors. My mum, I think, was quite a busy child. My mum would chuck me into the garden and hope that I'd stay out there for a nice long time. And I used to take snails for little rides around the garden on my tricycle, because I felt sorry because they can't move very fast. And kind of as I grew up, I used to spend a lot of time outside, making fires, making dens, all of that kind of thing. And outside has kind of always been my happy place. And when I was teaching, I would do a lot of teaching. Teaching often happens indoors, but once I was teaching, I was doing one-to-one teaching with teenagers who had a lot of problems. So teenagers with special needs but behaviour problems. So they weren't able to be taught indoors. Well, like in an ordinary kind of school environment, because otherwise they'd get into fights and all hell would break loose. And I'd be given like a half-term target for them to maybe engage with learning for 5 minutes, or to make eye contact 3 times in a lesson. And I'd bring these big bags of equipment and kind of bring out one thing and bring out another thing and bring out another thing and hope that something would stick. And it was quite a long, drawn-out process. And then I found that when we did things that were outside, suddenly I was hitting these targets straight away. So if we were going outside and like doing snail races, or if we were going bird spotting, or if we were doing kind of making a fire, suddenly they were much more able to engage. And so I thought, well, there's something in this, something really quite special, because it's so difficult to get them to engage, that actually kind of having this thing which magically works, if you could bottle it, you could make a fortune. So that's when I started Googling. I found out about kind of forest school pedagogy, the idea of kind of allowing children to explore outside, but to support them in that exploration. So then I retrained as a forest school practitioner. So I've been doing that for the past 4 or 5 years. And then more recently, I've trained as a forest school trainer. And I suppose as part of that, when I heard about people doing forest church, I thought, well, I fancy a bit of that. That's the kind of thing that would really fit with the things that are of me. You know, sometimes it's good to find something that actually kind of fits who you are, isn't it? And so I was at Greenbelt, and we went to some forest church, different things that were going in different ways. And I thought, this is what I'd really like, but there wasn't anything locally. And so I thought, well, maybe that's that nudge from God saying, okay, right, there's nothing happening about this. Get on and get it started. So I've been doing forest church locally here for the past few years as well. And I think, as far as I'm concerned, it's very much shaped by the kind of person I am, shaped by my forest school practice. So it's all quite play-based, and lots of kind of play, exploration, open-ended stuff. And yeah, so that's kind of what led me onto the books that I've written, because of the ideas that came out of that, conversations I've had with people to do with kind of my practice of keeping Lent, and people who, I suppose, spiritual seekers who are quite interested in that. And I said, well, shall we do keeping Lent together? We'll all try and do a different thing outside every day and see what that teaches us about spirituality, about faith. So that's me, kind of in a nutshell. Living here in East London, 5 children in a vicarage. I've got 10 chickens in the garden, guinea pigs upstairs, got dogs, got cats. It's a bit like a menagerie. It's a bit crazy, but I like it. You can do next slide. I was going to say, next slide, please. I'm going to do a Chris Whitty at you. This is a bit I've been excited about. So thinking back to my childhood, things that got me excited about being outside was, I can remember kind of that feeling of space and peace, especially being quite a busy child. It's kind of, when you're outside, something kind of settles you. I remember sitting for hours next to the pond, catching baby frogs and looking at them and watching them as they'd sit in my hand and eventually hop off. And that kind of sense of feeling connected with the world around me, that sense of peace. And so I suppose that's something that's been quite important for me. And as I look back, I can kind of see the influences of that through my life. So this is the first thing. Often when I'm doing training, I like to start with people's experiences from their childhood of being outside, especially like if I'm training teachers doing forest school. We've been kind of in an indoor environment for a long time. I think that's similar with churches, that we kind of are inside. And actually it's quite good to remember back to when we were children, what it was that got us excited, the memories we have. You know, they say, don't they, that children's best memories aren't going to be the day where they watched the telly and ate their beans and their chips and their fish fingers, but it's going to be probably sometime when they went outside and they had that sense of space and freedom. And it's been quite interesting when I do training, hearing different people's stories. Different people, kind of nice thing about being London based, you have people from all around the world, and often when you say to people, talk to me about one of the really special memories from your childhood, even if you're not saying tell me about outdoor memories, it's the outdoor memories that come in. I remember that we used to go off and make a fire and pretend we were living wild in the country, in the kind of countryside, and cook dinner in little tins. Or people say, I remember kind of making dents. Lots of different people's memories. I remember one person who grew up in the East End in the 60s, and she can remember kind of the space between the flats, which was essentially just a concrete space. But for her, it was this kind of wonderful, magical land. They used to kind of drag over bits of mattresses and rubbish and create this wonderful world. And I think it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because children can see beyond sometimes what, as cynical adults, we look at and just see as mess. And they can imagine it, and they can envisage something quite wonderful, something completely different. And she said, looking back from her position as an adult, she says, I can't believe I was playing that. I can't believe, to me, that this place felt so special. Kind of she used to kind of enjoy the fungus growing on the mattress, you know, the bits of green weedy stuff that she'd pull over to make the dinner. She says, it's not nice if you think about it as an adult, but for her it was something really special. So breakout room number 1 is going to be talking with each other about our outdoor memories, what memories we have from our childhood, particularly ones to do with being outside. And I think often if you are my age or older, then you've got a whole bank of outdoor memories, and actually younger people don't tend to. The statistic is, I think, that children spend less time outside now than prisoners. Actually, children don't get that space and that freedom that maybe we had growing up. So we're going to share some of our memories to remind ourselves about what it is about being outside that's really special, and talk about kind of what was it with those. Is there memories we've got from being outside that kind of we can see have fed into our spirituality, things that we remember from maybe our childhood being outdoors that have shown kind of we feed on even now in how our faith is and how our faith is shaped. Does that make sense? Marvellous, that's really good. So yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, hearing different people's stories. Something that came up in our group with this idea of kind of peace and stillness coming through as something that we remembered as special, and that we could see being something that was special in others. And I think it's interesting as well just quite how vibrant those memories can be, even if, in fact, for some of us they're a long time back, they seem to kind of stay, they almost shimmer in your memory, don't they, as something that we hold really dear, hold really close to us. So Margaret, next slide please. Excellent. So we know that being outside is important. We know that we were talking in my group about kind of, even if you have to drag children outside, you can kind of see the weight falling off their shoulders. I know that with me as well. Even if I have to drag myself outside, I get outside and I can feel it, feel this kind of sense of peace and serenity, connection. It's just kind of wipes the stuff you've been carrying, doesn't it, and gives you space. So there are a whole host of reasons why we might choose to take worship outdoors, and that's what we're here to talk about this evening. And so I thought it's worth unpacking some of those as well, because there's so many different reasons for it, and none of them are kind of better or more holy or more important than another. And I think it's quite useful to keep that in mind while we're talking. This picture here I really love. I don't know if anybody recognises it. So I'm in London, but I'm the Diocese of Chelmsford, and this little church here is St Sed's Chapel at Bradwell, and it's impossibly old, from built at the time of St Sed himself, using stones from the old Roman settlement at Bradwell-on-Sea on the Essex coast. And one of the reasons I've picked this is because I thought it's quite useful to think about, here's a building where worship has been happening for a long, long, long time. It's one of the oldest places of worship in my diocese, and yet around it you've got this wonderful space, you've got these fields, and you've got this immense sky. Essex is very good for skies, and we go there on the Bradwell pilgrimage once a year, and although the chapel in a way is a focus, it's also the space that's also the focus. And so rather than us just going and sitting inside the building, even though the building is beautiful and it's lovely and it's kind of soaked in prayer through the centuries, actually the ground around it has also been soaked in prayer throughout the centuries. And when we think about the whole world, even places that aren't next to a church, in the places that people haven't been worshipping in church buildings, all of it is soaked through with God's love. After all, if we believe that kind of God created it in the first place and loved our world into being, then of course all of the world is going to be sacred. So I think there is this sense of connection with the Creator when we go out and we enjoy and we become part of, and we become aware of ourselves as part of creation. I think that's one of the gifts that creation, being in creation, can do for us, can't it? I think sometimes when you're looking out at somewhere beautiful, then that's one thing, but remembering to be part of it helps you actually reflect on yourself and your place in the world, and the fact that actually, yes, God created this beautiful sunset, God also created beautiful you, and I think that maybe we need to remember that too. So that's one good reason to be outside. Another reason, obviously, at the moment, there are all kinds of practicalities around doing worship indoors, and it can get long and complicated to try and make it safe. And actually, as far as people's worshipping experience, sometimes it can feel a bit uncomfortable at the moment with spaces and with not being able to do this and not being able to do that. With the best will in the world, it doesn't feel normal, does it? And particularly, I mean, this is what I've noticed with my children when the churches were open. The bits that they go to church for, my children go to church for hanging out with people and eating biscuits, those bits aren't there, are they? So if you can actually sidestep everything and do something completely different, then maybe that helps as well. And when you are outside, you've immediately got that kind of lowering of risk, because outdoors you're 19 times less likely to contract COVID. Apparently that's what the statistics I was given. And also kind of all the stuff about touching stuff, you're not going to be touching the same things, you're not necessarily going to be thinking about sheets and pens and chairs. There's so much less to wipe down, isn't it? I was doing Forest School Toddler Club back before November lockdown, and so I had my kind of, this is my protocol, my risk assessment about kind of trying to keep things clean. I'm kind of walking around thinking this is a bit daft because I'm wiping down my mud kitchen between sessions and everything's just covered in mud anyway, so let's put a little bit more cleaning product on this. But yeah, obviously with outside you kind of got that kind of space to it, and you've got all the fresh air in it, so that does help. So it means it's something that we can do, and how lovely to be able to think in terms of yes, we can, rather than no, we can't, or no, we have to tweak it, or no, we have to change it. So it's quite nice to be able to have something different to do that feels positive. It's already effortlessly family friendly, even if worship outdoors is the worship that we're doing outdoors isn't particularly planning to be. I come from a church tradition that does lots of worship outdoors already. So we process around the streets with a cross when it's Palm Sunday. We process around throwing rose petals when it's Corpus Christi. That's a tradition that I come from. There's lots of being outside, and they're not necessarily child-friendly services, but there's something about taking children outside, the movement, the space, instantly, as a parent, makes you relax, because you know that they're not going to be crashing over and knocking over the stands, they're not going to be dropping the books on the floor, you're not going to have to drag them away from climbing and poking the pencils down inside those hot air blowers. Does anyone have those in their old church? You know, the bits that the hot air comes up from. They've got this lovely grill, and the children just sit there and drop things into it. So instantly you've kind of got this lovely, relaxing, family-friendly setting, even without having to plan anything new for them to do. I mean, even without kind of the plethora of things that you could do outdoors, just being outside itself is enough to relax me, and I expect that's the same for other parents as well. It is also family friendly because it is naturally hands-on, isn't it, being outside? There is stuff to touch and stuff to do. It's really multi-sensory, because there are things to smell, and there are things to see, and there are things to hear. Sometimes there are things to taste. You know, when you're a child and you see the world through your senses, or when you're slightly neurodiverse and you see the world through your senses, then actually it's really great, because here it all is for you on a plate. It's really seeker friendly, because it can be daunting to walk into that building in my picture there, because here's a building, maybe you don't know how you're meant to behave inside it. There's that door, and where there's a door, you've kind of got that sense of having to step over a threshold. If you're walking into a woods or into a field or onto a beach, and if it's local to you, it's probably somewhere you know and you've been before, then you immediately are at home. And if you're taking kind of creation to help you unpack the things of God, that's something actually we've all got experience of, isn't it? Everybody has been outside in the rain. Everybody has got dirt under their fingernails when they're planting seeds. So we're starting on something that everybody can get in touch with, rather than it being this kind of knowledge that sets people off on a back foot, makes people feel awkward. They don't know quite how to behave in it. And also the reason to take worship outside, kind of nature itself, the gifts it's got to teach us about the God who made it and the God who made us. So we've immediately got the gifts of weather, we've got the gifts of the seasons, we've got the gifts of the times of the day, the light and the darkness, all of those things which, if you're trying to create some kind of worship in a church, you've got to bring lots of things in order to do it. But nature is going to do that for you, because you don't need to kind of think, right, so now at this point we need to dim the lights, because I need to show about how kind of God is going to, how Jesus in his birth in Jesus is going to bring light into the world, because it's happening. Like if you're meeting up at dusk or if you're meeting up at dawn, here it all is already happening all around you. You can do the next slide, Margaret. Brilliant. So this evening is about outdoor church, and the reason that I think we picked that title is because there are actually lots of different names for different things that people are doing. And I think often you get this happening, don't you, when there's kind of some kind of blowing of the spirit, and all over the country, in lots of different groups, things start to pop up that are similar. So I know people who do forest church, I know people who do muddy church, people who do mossy church, people who name it all kind of different ways. And I think sometimes it's tempting to kind of see it as a spectrum. So on one side we've got people maybe doing something that's outdoors but very church related. So like I was saying, maybe one of those processions, it is outdoors and it is church. Maybe you've got people meeting up with children, doing some activities that they've brought from home, but they're sitting outdoors and enjoying the sunlight, having a picnic. That's outdoors, so it's outdoor church. Maybe you've got people who are meeting up and they're sitting reflectively and watching the sunrise. And that's outdoors, and it's outdoor church. Maybe you've got people doing brain freeze. You've got a whole bunch of different things that there could be, and I suppose it's tempting, isn't it, because we do like to categorise and think, well, maybe I'm over here, or I'm kind of here where it's a bit more churchy. I need to be pushing myself to something where it's a bit less churchy and a bit more, I don't know, wild, a bit more kind of creative. And I think we need to be aware of our human instinct to do that and to kind of rein ourselves back in, because actually all of this is beautifully valid, and all of us know the context that we work in and the people who we work with and the kind of people who are likely to be coming to outdoor church things that we put on, and we're going to know what's going to be best for them. And if what's best for them is using familiarity of church done outdoors, then that's what we need to be doing. If what's going to be best for them is providing something that's very nature-based, but using that to reflect spiritually, then that's what we're going to be doing. But I think we need to make sure that we don't kind of think this one's better than that one. All the outdoor stuff is going to be good for different groups in its own way. Next slide, please. So lots of different ideas about what it might look like. So I'm just going to move all your little faces over there so we can see my picture better. I don't know if you can. So I've got here a picture of my children, actually, we're walking. And so it might look like, I know people who do outdoor church as kind of a walking group. So they will meet up start with a prayer. They'll walk together. They might be talking about things of faith. It might naturally be bubbling up in the conversation. They might be deciding to talk about something particular to do with whatever season there is and reflect on that spiritually. They might sit for a snack, they might pray, they might sing when they eat the snack, they might not. But we were talking in my group earlier about the kind of wonderful gift there is of walking and talking, because it does looks like the road to Emmaus. It does. Here we've got a place to walk and to talk and to think. I do lots of my best thinking when I'm walking. I think that's probably what I'm struggling to think at the moment. I had COVID back in December. I'm still not quite up to speed with my walking, and I'm definitely noticing it with my thinking. But certainly with my teens, if you sit and you try and have a conversation face to face with teens, but probably with anyone, to be honest, it can feel a bit antagonistic, can't it? It can feel a bit like, I'm going to say this and so you have to react in a certain way. And sometimes that action of walking alongside is where people are able to unload, to talk, to open up, to think and dream together, to maybe be a bit more experimental with their ideas, to allow themselves to try out ways of thinking, to try out maybe ways of doing theology with each other, to kind of talk on an equal footing so children can think and dream as much as adults. It takes the pressure off to be walking alongside next to each other. So it's a really simple way of doing outdoor church. It's outdoors, it's church, because here we are walking together and talking together of things of God. But it doesn't need to be kind of complicated. It doesn't need to be a big group. It doesn't need to necessarily look like the way that church in a building functions, with something happening and then the next thing and the next thing after that. Next one, Margaret. Oh, so here we've got something that does look a little bit more like you can imagine a church group is. So this maybe would be a bit more like sometimes people, this is slightly more messy church style, I suppose. So it's young families in a group doing activities together. So meeting up on a regular basis, to do activities to do with, the ones I do is always kind of based on the seasons, using whatever's around to reflect back on what's happening spiritually at that time in churches. Right, next one, Margaret. Right, it might look like, here we've got some seasonality for us. So this is at Michaelmas. So he's got a hat made out of Michaelmas daisies. He's stuck on a bit of cow parsley for good measure. But using that kind of idea of, we're really lucky here, aren't we? Because we've got this lovely seasonality. And actually when we have, when the churches came to these countries, that's where they started sticking different festivals on, didn't they? They took what was already here, what, as it says in the Bible, isn't it, as God had already kind of says, people should be able to understand about God through the creation that he's made, and people kind of were fumbling their way towards that through all these festivals that they were having, understanding about kind of light coming back after darkness, understanding about kind of the growth in dark places, or understanding about new life bursting out of places that look dead. All of that is telling us truths about God and what God is like. And so here we are as a church, piggybacking on lots of those, Christianising them, and that's not a wrong thing to be doing, because as you Christianise them, it helps you, they help you to reflect back on what's happening in your faith, as much as your faith helps you reflect back on the season. So we've got Michaelmas here, picking Michaelmas daisies, thinking about the festival of Michaelmas. Often I use that to think about balance, because there it is at the autumn solstice, where the day and the night are equal lengths, and thinking about the idea of balance in our lives as we're tipping through into the dark days, thinking about how sometimes darkness can feel scary, but how sometimes it can be a place of growth. Thinking, sometimes I reflect about the kind of story of Martha and Mary, about that balance between being and doing, and kind of often in winter we kind of turn more introspective, don't we? It turns into more of a being than a doing through the winter. So that's my little Elijah when he was small and cute. He's 11 and still quite cute now, covered in flowers. Right, next one, Margaret. It might look like eating together. If we think about Jesus in the Gospels, often he's eating with his friends, and often that eating is happening outside, isn't it? So if you're thinking we've got loaves and fishes, that's not an indoor picnic, they're outdoors eating that, aren't they? If you think about Jesus meeting his disciples on the beach after the resurrection, that isn't an indoor meal, that's a picnic outdoors, isn't it? And eating together obviously is really important as part of our Christian life. We eat together with the bread and the wine when we have the Eucharist. We also often eat together in different groups, different meetings. It's something that brings us together as a community, and eating together outdoors is always wonderful, and it can be fairly simple to manage. So we have here, we've got pre-baked jacket potatoes, we've got baked beans cooking over the fire, not exactly gourmet cuisine. One of the best things about doing forest school training is that my trainees have to cook for me on days 7 and 8, and I have to assess the cooking that they do, and they have to cook me a 3-course meal. So by that point, I've done lots of training with them. By that point, my job is merely to sit and to tick things off on a sheet, so I can sit in a hammock and watch them cooking and eat their delicious things. So cooking together brings people together, eating together brings people together, and there's so much to unpack from the scriptures to do with eating together that it's a lovely way in. Margaret, next one. It might be as simple as noticing. I like using the word noticing, because often we talk in terms of actions and things that we have to do, but noticing is an action, but it's one of those kind of quiet actions, isn't it? And it requires us to decide to notice. And once you have decided to notice, to pay attention, you start seeing things everywhere, and it's almost like you're seeing little notes left for you from God, little notes left in creation through the Creator. And that's something that I think everyone can enjoy doing. It's not something that's just for children. Adults can do noticing as well, although sometimes I think it takes us a little bit of practice to get back into. Children are excellent at noticing. If ever you've tried to take a toddler for a walk, they stop everywhere. They notice the little cracks in the walls, they notice the little ants walking along the ground, they notice one leaf that looks different from the other leaf. As adults, I think sometimes we can lose that kind of finely tuned noticing, because we don't need to do it all the time. We've seen cracks in walls before, we've seen ants before, but I think sometimes it can be useful to help us to decide to notice, and that's something that we can do as a group. It doesn't have to be done as a kind of corporate gathered group. This is something that might work really quite well at the moment with people not necessarily gathered together physically, but I can imagine having something like a Facebook group or a WhatsApp group where maybe you're looking for signs of spring, people take photos of them, people share them, and then you talk together about what it is that they're speaking to you about. So when they're talking to you, kind of, what does that thing that you've noticed tell you about the God who created it, and what does that tell you into your life as well? So it's skills that it's worth building up. It might take a little while for people to be able to kind of think reflectively about it, but it's just nice to be able to notice, and nice to be able to, just that being aware is something that I think is very akin to prayer for me, being aware and seeing the world around me. Right, next one, Margaret. It might look like action. So here's a placard from an action that we went on as a family. There are all kinds of different ways that churches are involved in kind of eco action. There's signing up for eco churches and a Rocha. There's what's a Noah's Arky one called, Margaret? I can't remember that one. The Operation Noah, Operation Noah, they exist as well. So there are a whole bunch of things that churches sign up for, but also eco action is something that people outside churches are part of, and often people who are kind of quite spiritually attuned are part of. Often it's quite part of their kind of outworking of their spirituality, and it doesn't take much to help them to unpack them more. It's quite a lovely way to be able to speak with people about something that's important to them and important to you, and just to mark the fact that actually we all love this place that we call home, and we love it because it's special and because God made it for us to live in. So there's my poster about a tree. I was proud of that one. I like the colours in it. I liked all the different words I've got. So good old trees. I did lots of stuff about trees back in spring lockdown last year. My daughter says, oh, when is it spring lockdown again? I like that one best. So in spring lockdown last year, I got my chalk out and I was writing underneath the different trees, kind of was writing what they were, and then kind of reflecting back kind of parts, things that the tree was saying to us, not particularly religious things, but things that would be speaking into our situation for anybody. So for example, about like the English oak, it's a symbol of strength, or a lime tree, it's a symbol of freedom and protection depending on which country you are. So that idea of kind of taking ordinary things that we all have access to and allowing people to start to explore them on another level. And that's a really good way to get people to start thinking about kind of the theology behind what it is that they see, about kind of the God speak behind it all, rather than the things just as they are. So that's quite a nice part as well of kind of outdoor church, bringing it into some action as well for people who are active people. Right, Margaret, next one, please. Thanks. So here's something that I like to rant on about play. So lots of different types of being church outdoors, and lots of the things I've said do seem to involve ways of playing. I was saying how my way of doing Forest Church is really influenced by how I do Forest School, and so it is this kind of play exploration. And for me, I think that deep state of play, you know, when you see a child playing, often you don't often see adults playing, do you? So when you see a child playing and they are so engrossed in their play, they kind of lose track of time, of space, of anything. And that kind of state of flow that you call it in education when you're doing early years, I think is very akin to that kind of sense of prayer. For me, it feels very similar. When I'm engrossed in play, feels very much like when I'm engrossed in prayer, so much so that often I find they conflate. And I think that as adults, we kind of lose that sense of play at our peril, really. I think often children look up to us, they want to be like us, and the more we say, oh, here's some play activities for the children, the more they start thinking, well, I'm not going to do those because I want to be like the grown-ups. So I think it's quite important to offer play that everyone can take part of, and play sometimes looks different for adults than it does for children, and that's fine. But I think it's good to remember that it doesn't always have to be, here's a play for the children, here's the other activity for the adults. So here we've got someone who, I did Forest School for grown-ups back in September, because I thought when the children were back in school that there were an awful lot of exhausted grown-ups that I knew. So I did Forest School for grown-ups on Friday mornings. And so she's made a knife, she's whittled a knife, I taught her how to whittle her knife, she's made a nice little handle for it out of string, she's toasted her fruit bread, now she's using her brand new knife and spreading on her butter. And that's play, isn't it? That kind of sense of accomplishment, of kind of creating something out of nothing, that enjoyment. She was really, really happy. And to be able to offer people play in a church context, I think is lovely, because that's going to help people tip over into prayer. You can do the next one, Margaret. So play doesn't always have to have a purpose. Sometimes play just is, and that's wonderful. So we've got someone here she's up to her elbows in a muddy puddle, feeling it, it's really sensory. And I think that there's something about that kind of purposeless play. Obviously it's not purposeless, she's learning all the time about how the mud moves, how it feels on her hands, could be lots of vocabulary, lots of science, but also that sense of kind of purposeless play just because it's fun, just because it's enjoyable, I think also is quite good for us to remember and take part in, because it reminds us of how God enjoys us, not because of what we're going to be or not because of what we're going to do, but just because we are. And here we've got a muddy puddle that just is, and enjoying that just as it is, I think, is a really good step to enjoying ourselves just as God has created us. I think that's a really lovely thing to be able to offer people as well. Right, next one, Margaret. So here I've got a group of tweens and teens. I think play can be really important for this kind of age group as well, because often you offer activities for children. When they grow up, they don't particularly want to take part in them. Maybe they've done it 1,000 times, so they feel they're too grown up for that. They maybe don't want to take part in some of the more cerebral offerings that we offer for adults, but it's really important that they are able to be given space to think through the issues that are on their hearts, to have time and space to be, and to know themselves as part of a group, as part of a community, to know themselves as loved. And I often use whittling with children this kind of age because everybody likes whittling. There's something about kind of whittling round by a fire, or any of that kind of just kind of repetitive, mindful tasks that allow you to kind of lose yourself in the job that you're doing. And so we've got children just kind of whittling by a fire, and as they whittle, sometimes they'll be quiet, sometimes they'll chat, sometimes the talk will turn to other things. And so I suppose it's that mixture, isn't it, between that kind of purposeless play where we kind of can be kind of drawn up into just that heavenly joy, and kind of play with a purpose where we can think through, work through ideas, and a really nice bridging point. All right, next one, Margaret. And of course, there are the grown-ups who like to play. I am one of them, and I think sometimes we need to make sure that we make it quite clear that adults are allowed access to the play that's put out for and that it's for everybody. They don't have to just do the adult play. They can play over here making shapes in the Play-Doh, because that's a really lovely thing to do. So play is for everybody, and it's important for us to remember that. And if we can offer kind of experience of church with lots of open-ended things that people can be part of and playing, then I think that's a really valuable thing that we can give to people. Right, next one, Margaret. So we're going to have a bit of a think about what the barriers might be. So we've thought a bit about kind of that, all those different types of worship that might happen outdoors in all their different ways. And I've ranted on about play it to you enough. That's just my pet rant. And so think about what the barriers might be that might make it hard for it to happen, because obviously sometimes you have the ideas in your head, but making them become a reality can be much more difficult. Lots and lots of different things to think about, not exactly to worry about, but it's just worth having in your mind, because actually sometimes it's the working through the problems that can create the really good ideas, isn't it? Sometimes it's in those that you find kind of the real gems that maybe you would have missed otherwise. So let's go through my list and see how similar it is to your list. So I think my first one is weather. Let's see if I'm right. It was weather. I remembered right. Here we are. This is a really lovely quote here. Encouraging a child to go outside in all weather builds resilience, but most importantly, it saves them from spending their life merely tolerating the bad days in favour of a handful of good ones, a life of endless expectations and conditions where happiness hinges on sunshine. And I'm really aware of weather in my job. It's been ever so strange, kind of being off sick for a month and a half. I almost don't recognise my hands because they never look this colour. They're always ingrained with dirt. And it's been very strange to not know what the weather's going to be doing because I'm just so aware of it. So I think weather can be something that people worry about if you're trying to get something started. People say, what about if it's a rainy day? What about if it's bad weather? And people worry that we can only go outside when it's going to be dry and sunny, the perfect day, because otherwise everything that we've planned is not going to work. But actually, you know, when we're thinking back to kind of the reasons to be outside, one of the reasons is because of the gifts of God's creation to us. And part of that gift is the weather, isn't it? And living here, we're really lucky. We have lots and lots and lots of weather. It's one of the really good things about living in the UK. The weather changes all the time and you get to enjoy lots and lots of different weather all the time. And so if we take the weather as something that God has given us, then maybe we'll start to see it in a slightly different light. So rather than looking out the window and the skies turn grey and we go, oh dear, it's going to be awful, maybe if we start thinking, here's the weather and what's God going to give us through it, then we'll be able to notice it, to enjoy it, to listen to it and to hear what God's got to speak to us. So weather in and of itself isn't a bad thing or a good thing, it just is. And so maybe if it's rainy, you'll be able to go outside and notice kind of the rain kind of gushing off the roofs. We've got the roof of our church and the rain just literally pours off it in sheets when it's torrential. But again, if you go back to the scriptures, you've got the idea of kind of being soaked, isn't it? That idea of kind of God's blessings running down like rain. You've got lots of stuff to unpack about this kind of, it just comes and it keeps on coming. And if you're thinking about God and God's blessings, then they come and they keep on coming and they soak in, that idea about them soaking into the ground and allowing other things to grow. Things about, if you think about kind of cold weather, we've got snow, which we're always waiting for, but because it's the UK, we don't get very much of. Sometimes we can obsess about the winter and snow, but actually there's lots of other exciting things happening about the weather in the winter as well, isn't it? So we get ice, you get frost, you get hail, you get sleet, you get slushy stuff, and obviously in the winter you get this lovely darkness as well, which I think is quite interesting to unpack. So those are all the good things about weather. How do we kind of turn that from being something that is a barrier for us to access the outside? So I think the first thing, you know, that phrase, isn't it? There's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing. And so make sure people know what they're coming into, make sure they know that it's going to be outdoors, remind them maybe to check the weather forecast, or kind of follow up with an email or a phone call if you've got people booking in, to tell them what the weather's going to be like. People forget, don't they, when they're indoors all the time, that the weather maybe isn't going to be exactly the same as it was yesterday. If you've had a run of hot days but you know the weekend's going to be cold and rainy, it's worth reminding people, because otherwise they will have forgotten and they will turn up without a coat. So reminding people what it's sensible to wear. Often I get like small children who come out and they've got a million layers on, so they're toddling around, they're perfectly happy, and their adults come and they've got a little jacket and that's it, because they've spent so long getting the tiny ones dressed that they've completely forgotten that they need to stay warm and dry as well. So remind people that they need to wear clothes that are appropriate for the weather, and that kind of counts for everybody. There can be an access issue as far as wealth goes. So people who have money often will own this kind of stuff. People who don't often maybe won't. Maybe people will only have one coat and they can't get it muddy, or they'll only have one pair of shoes and they don't own wellies on. They can't get their shoes muddy, they're their school shoes. So it is important to remember that people might not have the right kit, and that actually expecting people to just come up with it can be a barrier in itself. So it might be worth thinking in terms of, I've managed to get kind of sponsorship before now from guilty estate agents. I mean, Walthamstow, the estate agents have this kind of angst in their heart that they're kind of pushing up the prices and pricing people out, so they have a pot of money to spend on things. And I have managed to get like school sets of waterproofs. I can imagine that it might be possible to get a church set of waterproofs, or a kind of toddler group set of waterproofs. Think in terms of maybe doing second-hand waterproofs. Often people have spare wellies, don't they? So it might be worth having a big box that people donate wellies to, so people can make sure they've got the right kit. So yeah, clothes for cold weather, clothes for rainy weather. Make sure people are aware that the weather is going to be there. It's not there if you're in a building, it is there if you're outside. So Margaret, next one. Right, so danger. So we were talking about this in our group, about the kind of how if you're outside you do need to risk assess. Obviously if you're inside, if you're in a building, you have to risk assess as well, but someone will has already done the risk assessment for you, and it's going to be fairly static, isn't it? I mean, pre-COVID the risk assessments were just there and taken as read, that you knew where the step was in front of the altar, and that you had to make sure that people didn't kind of, it's marked in some way so people don't trip up on it, and it's not going to change week on week, and you know what's there, it's going to be the same for every group. So it's true that being kind of outdoors does come with inherent risks. If we have people inside a building and the floor's nice and flat, they're not going to trip up on the floor. Take them outside and there are things for people to trip up on. So it is true that being outside carries more risk than being indoors in a safe space, but that in itself isn't an inherently bad thing. Nice quote here: I believe the biggest risk our children face today is never being exposed to risk. Because actually all of us have to learn to manage our own risk. As children growing up, if someone has always managed their risk for them, if someone has always only presented them with things that are safe and a situation to be in that is 100% safe, so they can never, there's never a danger that they might sting themselves on a nettle or graze their knee or scratch themselves on a branch, then they are never going to be able to learn to take that kind of risk assessment into themselves. So then you're going to end up with adults who've never had a chance to do it, and you give them a car, or you're exposed to someone offering them drugs, or any of the risks that you deal with as an adult every day. Things about running out of money at the end of the month, things about, I don't know, cooking your dinner and pouring your boiling water over your foot. I did that yesterday. The risks that you deal with, the more practice you can put in place, the better it is. So actually, as far as children are concerned, it's really important to allow them to manage risk in a managed way. So we're not saying throw them into the nettles, not saying here's a bunch of brambles, toss in a ball, go and fetch it. But I am saying it's important that they aren't always given a completely sterile, safe environment. And I think that goes for all of us, because particularly when we're thinking about worshipping communities, when we're thinking about faith, faith is quite a risky business. For lots of parts in the world, it will get you killed. Faith isn't something that is safe. It's not something that is sterile. And to give people the opportunity to explore their faith, to worship, to pray inside this slightly more risky environment, allows people to explore the risky nature of faith in a way as well, I think, to start to think about taking risks with their faith, think about taking risks with how they trust God, think about taking risks with kind of how they allow their life to live out their faith. So I think noticing risk is good for all of us, not just for children. So how do we do that in a way that is managed? And that's where your risk assessments come in. And when I'm doing forest school training, often I'll talk about risk assessments and risk benefits. And I have a column on my risk assessment forms, which is about the risk benefits. So for example, if I'm talking about nettles, my risk will be that someone will get a nettle sting, and my action I'll take will be showing people where the nettles are, talking about which the nettle plants are, getting even tiny children to kind of describe them, to draw around the shape of them maybe, to notice where they are in the site. So that's the action I take. So that's going to make sure that it's as safe as possible for the children to not be falling in the nettles and sticking themselves. I mean, obviously, if we've got a massive patch of nettles, I'll make sure that our activity is taking place probably away from them. But I'm not going to cut all the nettles down so that they're not there. My risk benefit is, of course, that the children learn to identify nettles, so that helps with their kind of knowledge of the natural world. It also is that they kind of feel this sense of pride that they're able to keep themselves safe. They think, I know what they are, I'm not going to touch them because they will hurt me. And I think we can do that all the way through with a risk assessment. If you think in terms of the benefits as well, the benefits of being in this place that's not 100% safe. In a way, I think often that helps with your planning as well, because God does speak to us through the world, and through these benefits. If you're thinking about the benefits of these risky things, often those benefits will speak to us about something to do with faith as well. So if you're thinking back in the nettles, you might think, what's God speaking to us through the nettles about? This kind of idea of beautiful, lush greenery. They're very low at the moment. They come up, they feed all these different plants, but they protect them, don't they, with those stingy hairs. So maybe that's something to reflect about, how God is kind of there all around the place, growing in these waste places, but protecting people, protecting us, and keeping us safe. So yeah, lots to think about, but don't be frightened of risk. Risk doesn't mean that it's bad in itself. It's like how we deal with it that matters, and actually it's an important part of life, but it's also an important part of faith. Next one, Margaret. This is another one that came up in my group, not sure about you. The idea about, is it Christian? That's, I think, the one that I find that I get more than anything else. I think as soon as you start taking worship outside of a building, people start to panic a little bit, and particularly if you take it into a green space, a forest or a mountain or a field or the beach, people worry that somehow you're going to turn into some kind of tree worshipper, and that it won't be a Christian thing. It will turn into something pagan and different. So my little picture here, I don't know if anyone recognises that, but that's not one I made this year, actually. That's made one I made another year, but that's a Bridget's cross, and because it was St Bridget's Day only the other day, and so this is something that I tend to do yearly. I don't know how much you know about the story of St Bridget, but the story goes that she was sitting with an old chieftain while he was dying. She was fiddling around. Well, I like Bridget, you see, she's a fiddler like me. And she's sitting and fiddling with the rushes that were strewn around on the floor. And as she's talking, sitting there with the old man and talking with him, she's weaving them together, and he notices what she's weaving, and she's woven them into this sign of the cross, and she's able to talk to him about her faith. And it's also the sign, it's also a symbol of the turning of the year. That's what it was used before. So I think maybe it was a symbol that she knew, that she was reinventing to talk about faith. And as I mentioned before, lots of our Christian festivals are hung onto the seasons. They're hung onto things that are already happening. And I think that it's worth using that, you know, because it reflects both ways, doesn't it? And what we can get out of remembering why we're celebrating Easter at this time of year, or why we're celebrating Halloween now, that's going to be quite helpful, rather than always coming at it from kind of the church end. If we come at it from the creation end, it's going to give us a different side of insight. So that's going to be quite useful. Another thing about, is it Christian? It's Christian because if you think about the scriptures, Jesus talks about the natural world all the time. He's always talking about nature, lots of his parables about nature. He's kind of immersed in it. It's something that's just there without even having to, it doesn't say, and then, I don't know, and then he's standing looking out at trees, because we're assuming that most places are outside. There's not a lot of inside. Hello, Margaret's cat. Which one's that, Margaret?
This is Algie. He hears you talking about the beauty of the natural world and wants to make sure you recognise him as part of it.
Nice to meet you, Algie the cat.
Oops.
So yeah, so lots of the scriptures are set in nature, and lots of the stuff Jesus talks about is inspired by nature. Lots of the Psalms are full of nature. Lots of the words that we say in church every week are full of nature. If you even look at a church, often if they've got those big pillars coming up, it looks like a grove of trees, and that's with a reason. It's meant to look like a grove of trees. That's why they started building them in that way. So we've got this strong nature coming right through our worship indoors, and so it seems obvious for that to sometimes spill out into the outside as well, where it actually kind of hooks up where it belongs so much more easily. Right, next one, Margaret. This is the other one that we mentioned in my group, that access to outdoor space. So I think sometimes we can worry that maybe nature's only proper, it's only valid if it's somewhere kind of beautiful and wild and inaccessible. And we think that maybe to access nature, it's somewhere that we need to travel to, maybe somewhere that's like a national park or somewhere that's a kind of designated reserve, and that those are the proper bits of nature, and they are beautiful. But this photo here is taken in my little patch in Walthamstow, and I often think that kind of, I don't know how much you lot do Harry Potter, but in Harry Potter there's this thing where you can create Horcruxes. You can put part of your soul in things by killing people, by splitting things apart. This is in a way my reverse Horcrux, because this is somewhere that I have kind of been part of recreating, and it feels very strongly that kind of if I was to have part of my soul somewhere, here it is. And so when my youngest, who's now 8, was very small and in a buggy, I was doing that thing where you're trying to get them off to sleep. I don't know if anyone has ever done this, but you're kind of going round the block and you get back home and you're hoping they're asleep and you can have a cup of tea and they're still not. So you go around the block but a little bit further, and you go round and they're still not asleep, so you can't stop for a cup of tea. So you go round a little bit further, and it was at the extreme end of one of my walks I found this little tiny patch of woodland. It's about 1/3 of an acre, and it's the wrong side of the railway tracks, the wrong end of Walthamstow. So you've got a park, you've got the allotments, and behind that you've got this tiny little green space. And I was walking around it, and the centre of it was full of tents, of rough sleepers, of big scary dogs, of big piles of human poo. There were syringes, and I knew it was where the drug dealers did their drug dealing, mostly in dusk and in the evening, but sometimes in the daylight as well. Not particularly a very savoury and beautiful place in a way, but you know, like I was saying about how children are very good at looking beyond, you know, that lady I was saying who grew up in the East End, who pulled all her mattresses, and in her mind it was this beautiful place. Well, my mind works a bit like that, and I was walking around the path around the outside of it, and I noticed all this bird song and all these butterflies and the trees and the sky, and I thought, this is beautiful. And here it is, walkable distance from my house, walkable distance from lots of people's houses in a kind of urban area in London. And I thought, why are we not able to use it? We need to be able to use this space. So when I started doing forest school, this was where I wanted to do it. And after a long toing and froing with the council, they gave me permission to start running sessions in my little patch. And as time has gone on, I remember the first time I came down and I found a den that I hadn't been involved in making. And since then, it's improved immeasurably. There's much less rubbish, much less drugs paraphernalia. There are people who sleep rough, but they kind of tend to keep it aside. As I've been there kind of day in, day out, I've built up a relationship with them. They're there when I set up, and I get them to keep an eye out on the site for me. And it's just been beautiful to see throughout lockdown how it's been so well used with different people. From being a place that's completely a no-go area, it's now this beautiful place of kind of freedom and space for all these people who are living in houses, flats without access to the outdoors. So it doesn't have to, it's a very long convoluted story to tell you it doesn't have to be somewhere out there and beautiful. It can be the scruffy edges of places, and actually isn't that where God works? The scruffy edges of places, not the bits that are made beautiful already, but the bits that are in need of redemption. And that's where I think God kind of gets his hands in, and this space is one of them for me. It's lovely to see how it's kind of changed and the way that it is for kind of people locally. So what I suggest that people do is that, I mean, sometimes churches have spaces outside, brilliant. If you do, then use them. Sometimes people have a relationship with someone who's a landowner, in which case brilliant, and use it. If not, just look at Google Maps, put it on satellite mode, you know, where you can see the kind of image rather than just the roads. Zoom in, try and find the gaps where the houses aren't, and then go and walk around there and see what it looks like on the ground. Because actually, I think that it's really important to remember that creation is all around us. Creation is as much in that flower bursting out from the cracks in the pavement by Sainsbury's as it is in the Lake District amongst the rolling hills and the mountains. And honing our instincts to notice where that creation bursts through in the world, I think is something that's really useful for us to do. The more we start to notice, the more we'll see it, the more we will be feeling that we're surrounded by these messages from God, by God's love, by God's kind of strength bursting through, by God's brightness bursting through, and we will start to notice these little patches of beauty everywhere. So don't get hung up on thinking it has to be somewhere natural and wild and beautiful. Everywhere is natural and wild and beautiful. We live in a world that God has given us, and all of it is soaked through in his glory. We just need to learn to do better looking sometimes. Right, next one, Margaret. Another one here is that sometimes we can get stymied because we're not quite sure how to start. We know that it's something maybe we'd like to do, but sometimes it's hard to come up with the ideas. So I think the first thing that I would say is there are a whole plethora of ideas out there. We've got books from me, there's books, there's a Forest Church book, there's I think a book called Outdoor Worship. I think there's various books of ideas. There are lots of ideas on things like Pinterest. Ideas isn't something that there are all over the place. But I think one of the most useful things we can do is to try to train ourselves to notice what's there already, to try to hear maybe what God is speaking to us through the creation that's actually there in our own spaces rather than somebody else's. So yeah, try and train your ears to listen, try and train your eyes to notice, and also allow things to be open-ended. We don't have to always be thinking in our minds what our end result has to be. And in a way, the more we can allow people to explore themselves, then if we can hold that space for them, then sometimes we can all have a chance to learn from each other about the things of God and the things of his world. And that makes it a really lovely level platform. Another thing that makes it really good for working with people of all different ages, because if we're all able to do that, often, like if I'm doing Forest Church, I'll say, we might choose to do this, we might choose that, we might choose to do something else. You might have your own good idea, or you might want to sit still and be quiet and have some quiet time by yourself to pray. If you're offering all these things, we come back at the end and we share, and sometimes the older people will have insights of something I hadn't thought of, or the tiny children will have done something that I hadn't thought of. And allowing that kind of freedom of access and open-ended exploration, I think, is something that is really special, because then it's something for all of us that we can all feed each other, being part of the family of God, isn't it? Part of the church. It's what the church is meant to be doing, is meant to be allowing all of us to feed each other. Right, next one. So, not quite sure how much longer we're meant to be talking, really, Margaret, but this was my last bit to be wittering on about. So I was thinking, because we're coming up towards Lent and Easter, it might be interesting just to talk with each other in smaller groups, because I am aware that here I am doing an awful lot of yakking, about some ideas that we might have for Lent and Easter. So my picture here was for Shrove Tuesday. So we were making pancakes on the fire, so cooking together, eating together, kind of being part of community together. We were noticing the flames, we were noticing the sound that the oil was making as it was sizzling, as it was popping. And then also we were able to use the ashes, so we were using the ashes to make a sign of the cross. We were doing signs of the cross on hands, and we were using them a little bit as a kind of X marks a spot for this is kind of sign of not just repentance, but also kind of promise and commitment for here I am. This group that I was working with here, it's kind of 50-50, half of them Christians, half of them people who would probably call themselves spiritual, or wanting their children to explore spirituality, but wouldn't call themselves Christians. So I wanted to allow the activities we're doing together. Good idea, Margaret. We'll share ideas in the chat and then she can save them. Perfect. So I wanted the symbols that they were making to be something everyone could get involved with, because otherwise I felt it would be divisive if I was saying this is a sign of repentance, like Ash Wednesday, full on Ash Wednesday stuff, if half the group weren't actually there. So that's why I kind of set it up as I did. So X marks a spot, here I am, I'm kind of noticing that I'm here, noticing who I am with kind of my failures and my successes, and kind of being aware where I am moving on. So that's what we were doing here. Two other ideas I've stuck on here is, you know, that picture of the spider web, that kind of idea, maybe looking for emerging signs of spring, people taking photos, people sharing photos. It doesn't have to be, good idea, Margaret, we won't do breakout rooms. Write ideas in the chat. So if you've got ideas, stick them in the chat, then Margaret will save them, share them somehow. I don't know if that's possible, is it?
Yeah, I will be uploading the recording of this session to the Children's Ministry in St Albans Diocese YouTube channel, and I'll put any ideas that you have in the description and comments there as well.
Oh, perfect. So by Margaret's wizardry, then if you write ideas for chat, other people will be able to steal them and use them as well. So yeah, sharing ideas about kind of the emergence of spring, this idea of kind of growth coming out of things that look dead, and sharing them together. Another idea I had this year about kind of soaring wood cookies. So something that I do an awful lot of. If you have a log and then you can saw little slices off, they come out in little circles. Oh, making dampers, think about how the love of God enfolds us. I like that. Little circles, which look a bit like gravestones. Thought maybe you could do one colour kind of looking dull, and then resurrection brightness on the other. Hide them around the place. When it's Easter, you could flip them all around and make them be bright. There's a whole bunch of things that we can be doing. Do you want to move on to the last one? In case anyone got any questions. Got time for some questions, Margaret? Tippity tappy on the chat.
We've got a couple minutes. If you want to, I'm going to try and, because there's about 80 of you. So I'm not sure I'll see if you just try and raise your hand in the...
I was thinking maybe they could just write them in the chat.
Yeah,
and
or
then
chuck them in the chat, that works.
That might be easier, mightn't it?
Or if you need to head out, you can head out. But if you have any questions or comments, do chuck them in the chat.
Oh, tree decorating. That's a nice one. Decorating a tree through Holy Week. I've done a lot of decorating trees through Advent and Christmas. I hadn't thought about the Holy Week one. That's really lovely. What else have we got down there? Painting stones and hiding them. That's nice. People are very keen on stone finding, aren't they? It's a good excuse for a walk too. Oh yes, hearts. Yeah. I've got my one easy reach. I'm not sure where it is. I've done hearts with that. If you get bendy sticks, talking about that flexibility of hearts are lovely, aren't they? And for Valentine's, if you get shoots of bendy sticks and you can bend them around and tie them, think about kind of how that's what love is, isn't it? Kind of bending around other people, relying on other people, propping each other up, kind of that give and take. Oh, they're lovely. There, you've got a whole book there, Margaret. You can go and highlight them all and then print them out.
These are brilliant. Excellent. And if you've got any questions or comments as well for Rachel, please do throw those as well. Finger labyrinths on circles of wood. Yeah,
that's lovely. And big labyrinths as well. You can mow them into your lawn, can't you? Oh, when I was doing my chalk drawings for other trees, I was chalking them on the roads as well.
We've done chalk as well with the children. I did it especially on Pentecost because we were going out into the world, and I had them write what messages on the pavement they wanted passers-by to know about Jesus.
Aww.
So yeah, you can be inner city with just pavement around and still do outside stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Scavenger hunt, love that. Any tips for encouraging less mobile elderly congregation members to join in? That's an excellent question.
It's a really good question. It's actually something that came up in my group as well, about how being outside can be more accessible in some ways, but less accessible in others. So I would say my friend Emma Major, she's from Volton Forest Church. I think she's written something, hasn't she, about accessible. I might find that, I'll send it to you, Margaret, and maybe you can get it to them. But do think in terms of how you can make outdoors accessible for people who don't have the same kind of ability to scramble and clamber. And what Emma has also said, I've spoken to her about it, that it's one thing about making sure that you find somewhere accessible. She says what she finds almost more frustrating sometimes is when someone says open to everybody, but she gets there and then she can't access it. And she says it'd be so much less frustrating if they said, open to everybody. We just want you to know that there are steps, or the path is too slippery and therefore it's not safe for somebody with limited mobility. Even passing on information shows that you are thinking about people and their needs. So not everyone can access everything, but I think if you're honest that not everyone can access everything, that does help. And there are places that people can access as well, isn't it? So if you are able to do outside stuff by a path that people can manage, or set it up so there are places to sit that are not wobbly tree trunks, then that can be really useful.
Fabulous. Well, if anyone's got any other questions, please do put them in the chat. But I think we're mostly getting thank yous, which I agree with. Especially since you have not been very well, Rachel. Really, really appreciate your sharing your wisdom, your passion, your experience. There's one question quickly before we go. Any ideas about using music or song? Obviously in line with Church of England COVID restrictions, I have to say, but in general.
Well, in line with COVID restrictions, being outside is really great because there's a whole lot of music you can make which isn't with your voice, isn't it? So not only have you got space, so if at some point we are allowed to sing as long as we are distant, then you've got some space. But also there's sticks, and there's bashing them on tree trunks, and there's bashing them on leaves. There's dry leaves for shakers. There's making May whistles, which I really recommend. I think, yeah, where can I tell you how to make May whistles? If you Google making May whistles, there will be a thing that comes up. They're brilliant. You can make them in April in London when the sap's rising. All kinds of different instrumenty things. It doesn't have to be voices, does it? Not at the moment. It's quite nice to do communal music making together.
Hitting things with sticks for the Lord.
Oh, yeah.
I love that. There was one disappeared now up the chat. Oh yeah. Forest School too, but training for this is for teachers. Is there an equivalent for Forest church leaders? Is there training available?
There isn't, but funny you should say that, because that is on my to-do list. I think it would be something that would actually be quite useful, because assuming that people kind of know all the kind of how to do a risk assessment and things, not people don't always. So I think it would be very useful. Yeah.
Well, let us know when you do have it, please.
It will appear.
What about the benefits of regular space versus going to different spaces? And I think we'll finish with that one.
Yeah, so when I first started doing Forest Church locally, I thought we've got lots of lovely green spaces, so it would be really nice to use all of them and kind of get different things from each place. And yes, there's something rather lovely in that. I found it was quite hard to keep a group if we were moving from place to place, and one month we'd be here and another month we'd be there. So in the end, I've kind of whittled it back to always being in the same place, just because I felt with my group it was easier to keep the people. I think it probably just, it's one of those things, it depends who you're working with, depends who your group are, depends what it is you're doing as well, because obviously if you're going to be doing walking church, then you're not going to be in the same place every time. You'd be very bored if your walk was always exactly the same. So maybe if you're keeping what you're doing the same but doing it in different places, then that kind of is still enough the same to keep people with you.
Excellent. And somebody has pointed out a friend who gets about with the help of a wheelchair and a helper dog, and what you were saying about accessibility. And then that, of course, does tie into a larger conversation about the general accessibility of wild places for people with mobility difficulties. So that's something that we could all get involved in our local areas as well. So thank you for pointing that out, Peter. Thank you so much, Rachel. I can hear the rain beating on my window, and I still just want to get out into it and start playing around. So thank you for reminding us about all the amazing creative possibilities of getting our hands dirty in God's marvelous creation, and reminding us that we are part of that and we are all beautifully made as well.